Sometimes, well, many times, the world can feel like a very loud place. It's as if there is an auditory arms race competing to see who, what can be the loudest. Will it be the hovering helicopter? The whining leaf blower? The dings, the pings, the snores, the rings? All of it, of course, beyond our control. So it's no wonder why some of us go to extremes just for an escape. We don't want silence, just solace. A way to tune out a world and its intrusions. Even creating a true crime show for sleeping. And in tonight's episode, you'll hear about a young man whose deep desire for personal space led him to a dark and dangerous place. What started as an epic road trip ended in a decades-long mystery when he made a curious turn down a country road, then disappeared off the face of the earth. No one knew what happened to him until a stunning discovery, some 30 years later, revealed the shocking truth. A tragic missing persons case with a twist no one saw coming. This is Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. It's Nancy, the creator of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me for this very special episode. In fact, I've decided to make all of August Listener Appreciation Month with 3 episodes devoted entirely to story ideas suggested by you, the listeners. Tonight's episode was drawn from 2 people and their suggestions. The first was a book suggested by a listener named Erica G., who recommended a fascinating nonfiction bestseller first published in 2017 and written by a journalist named Michael Finkel. The book is called The Stranger in the Woods, which is the primary source for this episode, along with a special shout out to Jessica G., who suggested I look into a related story, which I decided to fold into one full episode. I'll link to Michael Finkel's book along with several other key sources, but as always, this is the Dead Sleep version of events. Factual, but with my own take on things. Dead Sleep is 100% listener supported, and you can support the podcast should you choose via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. For tonight's episode, we'll escape the frenetic pace of our adult lives with a ton of stress, responsibility, and go back to a different time. An event that is for many a rite of passage, an introduction to the joy of our own company, a celebration of solitude. The first time traveling by yourself. For a kid named Christopher Knight, his solo adventure was going to be a road trip. It was the spring of 1986. And while Chris wasn't exactly a kid, he was 20 years old, with a job in an apartment he shared with a few roommates just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. But Chris Knight was, at least emotionally, in the final phase of his late teenage years. With this impromptu road trip, his last expression of youthful rebellion. It appeared, without telling anyone, he abruptly quit his job, cashed his last paycheck, and decided to drive, by himself, from Boston all the way south to Florida. His overall itinerary was gloriously vague. Chris knew he'd end up in Florida, but everything else was whatever, whenever, however he decided on the fly. Chris could follow any curiosity on any terrain, mountains, desert, beach. He could handle it all with his brand new car, a quirky little coupe utility vehicle called the Subaru Brat. The Subaru Brat. The Brat stands for Bi-Drive Recreation All-Terrain Transport. The front was all business, an angular square face of a station wagon, but with the back of a lightweight pickup truck, with an open cargo bed for any adventure. The target customer for the Brat was the aspirational, young, quasi-outdoorsy male, and they hit the bullseye with 20-year-old Chris. He was a smart, quiet, nerdy kid with an offbeat sense of humor who grew up in a small town in Maine. He'd never even seen much of the world beyond New England until now. This road trip was two things: an expression of freedom and a test of his limits. Chris wanted to find out, how far could he go? He had maps, of course, but the sheer scale of this journey made a map seem inconsequential. What did it matter if he took a wrong turn, if there was no destination in the first place? So, that spring in 1986, Chris drove and drove and drove south. He simply started in Massachusetts, then passed through the cluster of states that made up New England, then New York, New Jersey, along the edges of Pennsylvania with a nod to Delaware, then straight down to Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, then Florida. Along the way, he stayed in cheap roadside motels, took in a sight or two. But most of the time, he stayed in the car, by himself. He realized he liked the driving more than he did the stopping. His whole life, he'd always felt like he was out of place, an outsider. But now, in his car alone, listening to classical music as he looked out at the world through his windshield, he was exactly where he should be. So almost as soon as he made it to Florida, he took a few whiffs of the briny tropical air and turned back. And throughout those days, it didn't occur to Chris to contact his family up in Maine. He hadn't even told anyone he was even going on this road trip, so they wouldn't be expecting to hear from him anyway. Besides, this was a trip about freedom. And writing a postcard to your parents, wouldn't that defeat the whole point? So Chris and the Brat climbed their way back up north. From Florida to Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, all the way back up to New England, past Massachusetts, and all the way up to visit his family in Maine. Or so it seemed. It's hard to know, even now, what compelled Chris to do what he did next. Maybe he didn't want the adventure to end. Maybe he wanted to continue feeling this sense of peace and solitude, wanting it to last as long as it could, which wouldn't be very long. Chris was out of money, his car running on fumes, and yet he made the decision that day to keep driving, passing by his family's house, continuing on until he turned on some random road which led him to another road, and then a smaller road, and an even smaller road, until he and the brat bumped along a dirt path that led Chris right up to the edge of a dense forest he'd never really seen before. So he pulled the car over, got out with the brat, and headed to the truck bed, digging around until he found his backpack and a small tent. Chris maybe had enough supplies for a fun night or two of camping. It's unlikely he had much more than that. But off he went anyway, pushing his way into the untamed woods. There was no trail, no campsite, just trees. Sharp, brittle branches, no doubt digging into his ribs, scratching his face, clawing at his clothes, as if trying to hold him back and issue a stern warning. Don't come in here. Turn around now, before it's too late. Undaunted, Chris pushed deeper into the woods. He took 10 steps, 20 steps, before the trees closed behind him. Within a matter of minutes, he would have lost sight of his car. By nightfall, he was utterly, completely, hopelessly alone. In life, as Christopher Knight knew it, it was over. The road trip that was supposed to be his first would prove to be his last. It took time, far too much time, for Chris's family to realize he was missing. Part of the issue was, of course, his family didn't know he went on a road trip. They thought he was in Massachusetts working, until his former boss called, irate, because Chris just up and left, no notice, walking off of his job, installing security systems, taking with him expensive tools, which Chris's family would end up paying for. This was aggravating, but the real troubling sign came when one of his brothers learned Chris had stopped paying for his car loan. This was problematic for his brother because he was the co-signer of that loan, which meant he was now stuck with the responsibility of taking over the payment of that brat. So it was annoying and concerning. Anyone could understand a 20-year-old bailing on a lame job, but stopping payments on his new car? Risk having that car getting taken away? And put one of his brothers in a bad spot? Chris, he wasn't like that. They were native Mainers. They weren't particularly sentimental, touchy-feely people. No big hugs or long I love yous. But still, they expected to hear from Chris. Eventually. And yet, days, weeks, months passed with no word from their son. And that's when Chris's mother, Joyce, began to worry. They wondered if they should reach out to police. But what could they do? Chris was 20 years old, an adult. In the Knight family, they put a premium on being self-reliant. Chris's parents knew the boy could take care of himself, and they'd hear from him eventually. And yet his brothers also knew Chris's tendency to be arrogant and reckless. Like that time he and one of his brothers went skydiving. There they were, some 13,000 feet in the air. It was Chris's first time on a plane, any kind of plane. The instructor barely finished giving the crucial instructions on what exactly one should do before jumping out of an airplane when Chris jumped. So eager to be in free fall, he didn't even think about what was going to happen after that 1 minute and how he would land. Time passed. No word. The 80s turned into the 90s. The 90s turned into the 2000s. In 2001, Chris's father died. By then, they had not heard from Chris in 15 years. An obituary was published in the newspaper with details about the funeral. Chris never showed up. Chris's 4 older brothers knew. Their little brother was dead. But they kept their gut feelings about their brother's death a secret from their mother, which meant lying to her and lying to themselves. That one day he'd come home. So the Knight family never contacted authorities. Maybe if they had, they might have learned there was another alarming discovery. Chris Knight wasn't the only young person who up and disappeared in Maine that spring. On May 10th, 1986, another local kid, a 17-year-old named Kimberly Moreau, walked out of her house and never came back. That night, she was supposed to attend her prom, but at the last minute, she got into a fight with her boyfriend and instead decided to go out with a few other friends. And those friends, they would later swear they dropped her off within walking distance of her home that night. And yet, she was never seen again. Now, their circumstances were different. Kimberly was under 18 and still in high school, and her parents and siblings were beside themselves with worry. They posted 8.5 by 11 signs with Kimberly's picture in every store window and lamppost. And after a week or so, when she hadn't turned up, authorities had to consider the worst: that Kimberly was a victim of homicide. And whoever did it had hidden her somewhere in the woods. There were a lot of woods in rural Maine, and so they searched and searched and searched, but found nothing. Even to this day, Kimberly Moreau has never been found. But something that might have happened if the Knights had gone to the police when Chris initially disappeared was this. Maybe state troopers would have spread the word. Just keep an eye out for Christopher Knight, a 20-year-old white male around 6 feet tall, slim build, thick dark hair, with brown plastic aviator-style glasses. Maybe they could have also noted Chris Knight drove a 1985 Subaru Brat. And maybe nothing would have come of it. Or maybe someone would have ventured down a dirt road, and when they did, they might have noticed a Subaru Brat, by then covered in leaves and brush and dirt, seemingly abandoned. They would have noticed the car unlocked, the keys on the console, with the person's belongings still inside. And maybe they would have checked the license plate, figured out the car belonged to Chris Knight. Maybe they would have brought in a tracking dog or two and given those woods a good once-over. And maybe, all those years ago, in the spring of 1986, they could have found Christopher Knight. And maybe they could have stopped this whole twisted thing before it even started. Before the fear, the terror, the destruction, and the obsession began. She was obviously insane, ridiculous, paranoid. This was a summer cabin along the North Pond, one of the nicest destinations for rest and relaxation, peace and quiet in all of Maine. There wasn't a car alarm or even a car in sight. Nothing but the sounds of summer. Chirping crickets, warbling frogs, the only light the gentle flicker of fireflies. No movement except the hollow knock of a canoe bobbing on the lake at the end of a dock. There was no one around. There couldn't be. And yet, the woman in the cabin couldn't get rid of that creepy, unsettling feeling. She was being watched. And it wasn't clear how many there were or what they wanted, not yet. But she could feel the eyes on her and became so frightened. She, like many of her neighbors, came to dread the simplest of tasks. A quick run to the store to get some groceries could end in a violating home invasion. When the break-ins began, in the early 1990s, it seemed obvious the culprits were teenagers. The thieves targeted vacation homes, never the year-round places. And when they broke in, they cleaned out the liquor cabinets. They even took mattresses off the beds. You could imagine a bunch of kids hauling off all that stuff somewhere, taking it out into the woods, creating a clubhouse party spot. But there was one problem with this theory. Teenagers, they tend to grow up, move on, move away. And yet, year after year, season after season, the break-ins continued, which led people to wonder if maybe the thieves were their neighbors. Someone who was getting cheap thrills off of messing with the very people next to them. But who would go to such extreme lengths for such a long and consistent period of time? Of some 100 cabins, more than half of them have been hit, some of them multiple times. Eventually, an amateur thief would get busted. And whoever this was, they were no amateurs. The break-ins always happened when the people weren't there. And when they returned, things looked so ordinary and intact, most didn't even know they had been burgled until they went to reach for something. A book they had by the side of the bed, a pair of jeans in the closet, some Halloween candy in the freezer, a bottle of booze in a liquor cabinet, a pair of underwear from a drawer. And at first they'd blame each other. Who ate my? Until they looked a little closer at a slightly manipulated lock, a latch that wasn't quite closed. Then they would realize, to their horror, someone had broken in, rifled through their most intimate belongings, and they had no idea who it was, how they got in, where they went, and if they'd be back. Once, in the early 2000s, they did get a hint. By then, security cameras were affordable enough that people started installing them around their properties. And one night, one of those security cameras captured something. A figure, a shadow, a man who appeared to be wearing maybe a hoodie, but they couldn't make out any specific features. And when they shared the grainy image in the community, no one had a clue who it could be. But this figure only helped fuel the myth around the person they began calling the North Pond Hermit. This mountain man who lived in the Maine wilderness and lurked somewhere out there in the dark. This image, of course, scared children. And so parents tried to ease their children's mind by saying that whoever it was, they were just hungry. It was just a hungry man. But over time, the lore of the hungry man ate away at the once trusting community. People used to keep their cabins unlocked year-round. Now they kept their curtains drawn, their doors bolted, their children not allowed to play outside by themselves, nor did they want to. And they all disagreed on who it was and how to handle it. Some said they were all overreacting. Just let the guy take what he wants. Others said people weren't doing enough. It had gone on for too long. And it couldn't be just one person. There had to be a few of them, or at the very least copycats. This guy, these people, they were dangerous. And these cabin dwellers, they were fed up. Some even slipping into vigilante mode. They fantasized about slipping rat poison into, say, a bottle of vodka. Or surprising him, painfully, by hiding a bear trap under a pile of leaves. They never followed through on these ideas, but one man did spend roughly 2 weeks alone in his cabin. Lights off, gun loaded, waiting for someone to break in. And he was ready to give that hungry man a belly full of lead, if it came to that. Authorities, however, hoped it wouldn't come to that. And over the course of 20 years, they'd tried just about everything. They dusted cabin windows and doors for fingerprints, searched the grounds for footprints, scanned the shorelines, flew over the entire area. Not a trace. No sign of a campsite, not a curl of smoke from a campfire. It was as if this hermit was superhuman, and he would outlast them all. That is until someone noticed. He had a pattern. That the hungry man, he behaved a lot like a ravenous bear. At last count, the state of Maine boasted 35,000 black bears, the highest number of that species in the eastern United States. And those bears, they all follow the same instinctual behavioral pattern. From around November until April, black bears go into a dormant state called winter torpor. It's not quite hibernation. They're not in a deep sleep, but their bodies, their metabolism, their organ function, it all slows down to a crawl. But to prepare for that dormant period, bears eat as much as they can in the fall, loading up those extra layers of fat so they can survive the winter. And as you might expect, come spring, they're hungry. And once again, they go on a mad forage for food. And well, this hermit, he followed the same seasonal pattern. His break-ins increased and peaked in the fall. Then nothing in the winter, until that second spike in spring. So perhaps, instead of this year-round goose chase, what if they tried to catch him in the act and trap him like they would a bear? Not with threats, but with food. In the spring of 2013, a local game warden named Terry Hughes set up a high-tech trap inside one of the hungry hermit's favorite spots, the kitchen of the Pine Tree Summer Camp. It was April. The summer camp wasn't open yet, but large food orders were already being delivered to the kitchen and stored in commercial-grade walk-ins. Exactly the type of place their hermit would go. To pull it off, Terry Hughes had to borrow some state-of-the-art motion sensors typically used along the U.S.-Canadian border, and he arranged to have them hidden throughout the Pine Tree kitchen, including along an ice machine and a juice dispenser. If the motion sensors captured any movement in that kitchen after hours, it would be Terry Hughes who received the alert. He spent several months strategizing, researching, and mapping out this plan, all for it to come down to a matter of seconds. 2 weeks after installing the sensors, Officer Hughes received a flurry of alerts. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, and someone was in the Pine Camp kitchen. Hughes leaped out of bed, got his gear together, including his gun, and made his way down to the camp, carefully turning off the lights and the engine of his truck from several yards away, so the hermit wouldn't hear a thing. He maneuvered his way to the side of the building and peered into the window. Indeed, there was someone in there, a burglar, efficiently filling his pack with food. So Officer Hughes went to the back of the building, and he made a quick phone call to let someone know. He was there, and Hughes was going in. With a mag light in one hand and a gun in the other, Officer Terry Hughes walked into that building. In the dining hall, he saw the silhouette of his burglar, and he aimed his flashlight straight into the burglar's eyes. The man now stood just a few feet away. Officer Hughes then raised his gun. And then he took a few steps back, just in case this man drew his own weapon. Officer Hughes yelled something, a single phrase he'd been desperate to say since this whole thing started some 25 years ago. "Get on the ground," he said. "Get on the ground." The man, he obeyed immediately, getting on the ground, face down, then putting his wrists behind his back as ordered. But it wasn't over yet. Terry Hughes was a game warden. He did not have the authority to make a formal arrest, which was fine, because he wanted to let State Trooper Diane Vance have the honors anyway. Since Diane Vance joined the force in the 1990s, the man who many called the North Pond Hermit had become her obsession. She tracked him for years. Over her long career, she'd confronted her fair share of bad guys, but no one was more mysterious, more elusive, more maddening than this thief who kept an entire community on edge for decades. And now he was in custody. It was just after 1 a.m. when Diane Vance received the call. She was already on duty, and she raced her way to the Pine Tree Camp kitchen. And when she walked into that dining hall, she saw her longtime buddy and colleague, Officer Terry Hughes. At his feet was his suspect, face down on the ground, his hands behind his back. This was their guy. It was dark. He was turned away. She couldn't get a good look at him. But over the years, the image most people had of the North Pond hermit was something between Bigfoot and Charles Manson. A big, scary, hairy man with long, greasy hair and a scraggly beard and crazy eyes. But as he was cuffed and then hauled up and put into a chair so she could read him his rights, she experienced a flash of confusion. They'd made a mistake. This wasn't the hermit. He couldn't be, because he didn't look like a man who had been living in the woods. He didn't look like Charles Manson or Bigfoot. He looked like a suburban dad. This man didn't have scraggly hair or a long, shaggy beard. His hair was cropped short, and he was perfectly, meticulously clean-shaven. He was slim but not emaciated, and he wasn't wearing old rags or animal skins. This man wore what appeared to be a brand new winter coat, a wool cap, and a fresh pair of Levi's. He and his clothes were clean. The only item on him that had obviously seen better days were his glasses. He had on a pair of plastic brown aviator glasses that looked like they were something out of the 80s. Diane exchanged looks with Terry, as if to say, "Are we sure? Is this really our guy?" But she read him his rights anyway. And as she asked him questions, it was clear he planned to take the right to remain silent part to heart. He wouldn't say a word. He didn't look frightened or angry. He just looked blank. She asked him his name. He opened his mouth. In a rusty croak, he said his name. For the first time in nearly 30 years. "My name," he said, "Christopher Thomas Knight." It was hard to believe the story this Christopher Knight told. How sometime in the spring of 1986, at 20 years old, he walked into the woods and just never left. How he roamed around the Maine woods for a couple of years before settling down in the 90s in a hidden away spot behind some giant rocks near North Pond. And that was the place he called home for 25 years. The place was not remote, but it was secluded. And when she visited the site, she was stunned by how private it was and how he had turned it into a home, including, she noted, a pretty comfortable-looking mattress with several sleeping bags and a pillow on top. And during that time, he encountered very few people, and he recalled speaking to someone once. One day, he just happened to cross paths with a hiker in the woods. The hiker said something, and Chris said, high. And that was it. 27 years. One high. He would later tell the journalist Michael Finkel he never even spoke to himself. As unbelievable as it all seemed, Diane Vance came to the conclusion everything Christopher Knight said was true. That he spent 10,000 nights out there in the Maine woods, alone, even in the wintertime. He managed to stay alive throughout those Maine winters without ever, not once, lighting a fire. He was afraid the campfire would lead people to discover him. All he wanted out of life was to be alone. And they could call him a hermit, but he really did live like a black bear, where he stockpiled during the late summer and fall, then stayed in his tent, dormant, under several sleeping bags throughout the winter, then emerged in the spring and started all over again. And what did he do during all those years, alone? Christopher said he listened to the radio. He occasionally watched the news on a little battery-operated TV. He spent a lot of time trying not to look like a hermit, ensuring he was always clean-shaven and relatively well put together. And other than that, he hung out. He didn't pen his memoirs or contemplate philosophy. He wasn't even really a survivalist. He didn't know how to kill his own food. He just did nothing in nature. And he loved it. Most of the time. And yes, there were times he was cold and he was hungry, but something he swore he was not, ever, the entire time, was lonely. In fact, when he would study those houses, looking for a cabin to break into when they weren't there, the more he watched people, the more he knew he'd made the right choice. And he wasn't a complete misanthrope. He said he did his best when he burgled these cabins to take things that people didn't need or didn't want or wouldn't miss. One time he said he took a backpack, and when he realized there were the passports inside, he made a point of going back and returning the passports, though he still took the backpack. All of those things that people might have misinterpreted as ill will, casing the cabins and taking specific objects, he swore was just ensuring his survival. And he didn't mean to harm anyone. Diane Vance had to make Chris understand he had harmed people. And when she asked him about how many break-ins do you think you did, he admitted probably 40 times a year. Over what, almost 30 years? Which, when Diane Vance tallied it all up, she counted over 1,000 possible felonies. And she realized, based on those numbers, their little North Pond hermit case was now the biggest burglary case in Maine history, by far. When Christopher Knight went into the woods in 1986, he was 20 years old. He came out of the woods 47 years old. He spent the first half of his life surviving the wilderness. Now he'd have to find a way to survive prison. Chris said he understood. He said he was ready to face up to what he'd done. And he admitted to all of it. Everything he had was stolen. Well, except for these glasses. But everything else, he couldn't lie. He'd taken it all. Chris's greater fear was facing his own family. He was ashamed of what he'd done, and he felt enormous guilt for the emotional and financial pain he knew he caused. And he told authorities he hoped somehow his family wouldn't find out. But that would prove, of course, impossible. The story of the North Pond Hermit, the man who lived alone in the woods with no human contact for nearly 30 years, he was an international sensation. With that news came an outpouring of public support. Virtually overnight, the North Pond Hermit was a folk hero. He'd gone from stranger in the woods to global celebrity. While in jail, he was swarmed with offers for interviews, marriage proposals, cash to help him post bail. Someone even offered to donate a large swath of private land for the North Pond Hermit to call his own. A documentary film crew turned up, eager for an interview. Chris turned them all away, as did his family. Chris's mother would later tell Michael Finkel, the journalist, that she was happy, of course, that he was alive and that he'd come home. But the situation was an enormous strain on the whole family. His brother was pretty mad that Chris was alive and all the time he had to pay off that car loan. A Subaru Brat that, as far as anyone knew, was still somewhere on the side of a Maine road. By now, just a junk heap. But people remained fascinated by Chris's story. And therein lies the great recluse paradox. As a rule, hermits want to live alone, away from society. For various reasons, they just don't want to be around people. And yet, the very fact they are hermits draws people to them. And this ironic celebrity rarely ends well. Before Christopher Knight made headlines, the most legendary hermit in the U.S. was Robert Hamill, better known to tourists in North Carolina as the Fort Fisher Hermit. The Fort Fisher Hermit lived for 17 years in an abandoned World War II bunker along the Cape Fear River. His eccentric personality and friendly demeanor made him one of the area's most popular tourist attractions. He was an unusually affable hermit and much beloved by the community. But more than once, his solitudinous lifestyle made him a vulnerable target. When he died in 1972 at just 62, the cause of death was determined to be a heart attack. But for years, friends and family, including his son, suspected something more sinister. At one point, exhuming his remains for a second autopsy. But no formal investigation was ever launched, no conclusion ever reached. As for Christopher Knight, he received thousands of dollars in donations to help him post bail. But he said he didn't want it, and even if he did, he couldn't have it. The district attorney made sure any cash donations went into a hefty restitution fund to pay back his many victims. He also turned down all media interviews with the exception of the journalist Michael Finkel, who met with him several times after his arrest and followed his case until it was resolved. And the resolution didn't come easily. It was hard to know what to do with Christopher Knight. But in the end, the district attorney worked out a deal. He wasn't charged with 1,000 felonies, and he didn't go to prison for the rest of his life. He did do some jail time, but mostly what he got was what it appeared he needed most. Some help with his mental health, and a roof over his head. When he got out of jail, he moved in with his mother. His brothers lived nearby, and it seemed he was going to enjoy a normal life, a private life, out of the spotlight. Though enjoy might be a bit of a stretch. Because if Christopher Knight had his way, he would likely live back out in those woods and go back to doing what he did for years. Climb into a cozy sleeping bag, all by himself, while he enjoyed some ice cream stolen from someone's freezer, finished an old spy novel, started another one, until he fell asleep under the stars. And when you put it that way, being a hermit sounds like heaven. Thank you, as always, for listening to another episode of Dead Sleep, and thank you so much for listeners who suggested these great story ideas. Keep them coming. I'll be back in about 10 days with another true crime story made for bedtime. Until then, nighty-night.